Zoom. Yeah. Okay. So welcome to today's Global Studies talk, the latest in our series on the U.S. and the global in the U.S. And let me just do some bookkeeping, which means thanking all the people who have been making this series possible, even though we haven't had to arrange flights and hotels, unfortunately. I wish we had to arrange that, and I wish we were able to have in-person gatherings with our speakers. But this series, nonetheless, is going on and probably will be extended because we haven't used up the budget as a result. Thanks to the support from the Haynes Morris Endowment Fund, and our co-sponsors include the Center for Global Engagement, departments of sociology, history, geography, political science, and anthropology, and Africana, which is now a department, Latin American and Caribbean studies, and Middle East studies, and I think Asian studies, all the different units around campus that we could get who might have anything to do with global studies. We expect, we are working on the final details, but we expect to have one more talk still this year with Professor Zhou Yue Wang, the last Friday of April. We're still confirming details, and he would be speaking about a book that he's working on about Chinese American scientists. So if you want to pencil that into your calendar, if you're interested, go ahead. And I think with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Alex Moulton, to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Paul. Today's speaker is Dr. Mimi Scheller. Professor Scheller is the inaugural Dean of the Global School at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts. Until 2021, she was Professor of Sociology and Head of the Sociology Department, as well as Founding Director of the Center for Mobilities Research and Policy at Drexel University in Philadelphia. She is a co-founding editor of the journal Mobilities and past president of the International Association for the History of Transport, Traffic, and Mobility. Dr. Scheller holds a BA in History from Harvard, MA in Sociology and Historical Studies, as well as a PhD from the New School. She has helped to establish the new mobilities paradigm and is considered one of the key theorists in critical mobilities research, as well as in Caribbean studies. Dr. Scheller serves on the International Board of Advisors for the Society for Caribbean Research, the Center for Advanced Research in Global Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, as well as the Bowman Institute at the University of Leeds. She's also affiliated with the Asia Mobilities Research Network and the Academy for Mobility Humanities at Konkuk University in South Korea, as well as work in collaboration with the Global Partnership for Informal Transportation. Dr. Scheller is the author of over 130 academic articles and book chapters, and is author or co-author or co-editor of some 15 books, including Advanced Introduction to Mobilities, published in 2021, Island Futures, subtitled Caribbean Survival in the Anthropocene, published by Duke University Press in 2020, Mobility Justice, 2018, from Verso, Aluminum Dreams, one of my personal favorites, The Making of Light Modernity, 2014, from MIT Press. Other titles include Citizenship from Below, Consuming the Caribbean, Democracy After Slavery. It is our pleasure today to have Dr. Scheller share a bit of that research. Much of it today will be focused on Haiti. Thank you for visiting us, Dr. Scheller.
Thank you so much, Alex, for that comprehensive introduction. Wow. And it's really great to be with you here. And I am going to share my screen. I do have some slides. Let's see. Oh, I'm showing two of them. Hold on. Let's see. Are you seeing that slide share? Okay, great. So the title of my talk is Haitian Histories, Haitian Futures, Revolution, Reconstruction, Reparations. And this talk is partly about my book, Island Futures, which was published around the 10th anniversary of the 2010 earthquake that happened in Haiti, and that brought me to a series of research projects that brought me back to Haiti after some time since I had been there. So I'm going to begin the talk, though, with a broader kind of perspective on my own work and what led me to it before linking it to my position as an US American citizen and the role of the United States in the region. And I know you're interested in the global relations of the US and the US in the world, and that's what I decided to try to focus on here. So first, as Alex mentioned, I began my work as a historical sociologist, and my PhD dissertation at the New School was published as Democracy After Slavery, Black Publics and Peasant Radicalism in Haiti and Jamaica, and that came out in 2000. And that was looking at the 19th century efforts of, after the ending of slavery, the kind of transition to freedom or emancipation. And I was comparing peasant uprisings that happened about a generation after slavery ended. So Haiti ended slavery through its famous revolution. And there's much to be said about the revolution, which I'm not going to focus on particularly here, except that it's the key event in the history of the forming of the entire kind of Atlantic world and the ending of slavery and the shift towards democracy. And there was a rebellion that happened in the 1840s. So Haiti's independence came in 1804. So 40 years later, something called the Piquet Rebellion. And it was a sort of movement from below, from the people who had been plantation workers and became free sort of farmers, and they called themselves peasants, paysans. And that's very important for looking at more recent history in Haiti, is understanding that the people who were freed in the Haitian Revolution, who freed themselves, were still fighting for their freedom in the 1840s and subsequently. And in Jamaica, there was a similar struggle after emancipation through something called the Morant Bay Rebellion in 1865. And those two events are comparable. They're similar to what happened in the United States, which is after slavery ended, there was the period of Reconstruction, and then there was an ongoing struggle for freedom and emancipation. I just wanted to lay that groundwork that this is a deep history that goes back to the Haitian Revolution, and informed my subsequent sort of work on studying the US relationship with the Caribbean and the wider Atlantic world in consuming the Caribbean in 2003, which really looked at 500-year history of consumption through the colonization of the region, the consumption of labor, bodies, food products, commodities, culture. And then in my book, Citizenship from Below, I was revisiting the kind of history of the 19th century and thinking about the struggles from below to sort of create an ongoing lived freedom and embodied freedom. And so all of that work was I would call this sort of first phase. And then we get to the 2010 Haiti earthquake. And I'm going to circle back to what led to my interest in Haiti. But in 2010, as you probably know, there was a 7.0 magnitude earthquake. 230,000 or more people perished in that earthquake. 300,000 were injured, 1.5 million left homeless. It was a huge event. And after the earthquake, there was a huge sort of inpouring of aid and humanitarian groups and NGOs, as well as military troops from the US and UN troops who were there to help, they said, in the reconstruction of Haiti. And President Bill Clinton was very involved. There was this notion of build back better, that they were going to reconstruct Haiti. And I had the opportunity to go back to Haiti at that time with a research group from Drexel University. And so my subsequent work was sort of informed by that experience. And one of the great sort of lessons of that experience was the failure of the reconstruction effort. And also the fact that the UN troops that were there, peacekeeping troops, introduced cholera, and that led to an additional 10,000 or more deaths from cholera and 800,000 plus infections, and the UN never really took responsibility for that. So I entered this phase of work very critical of what was happening. And you'll see in these subsequent series of publications, if you look at the dates on these were all after that earthquake, after my trips back to Haiti, that I began finishing this other series of work on Aluminum Dreams, which is about environmental injustice and bauxite mining in the aluminum industry in the Caribbean and across the world, Mobility Justice on the politics of movement, where I was also reflecting on my own mobility back and forth as I was traveling to Haiti and also the Dominican Republic during this post-earthquake reconstruction period, and observing all the travel of humanitarian actors. And all of that culminated in the publication of Island Futures as I reflected on that 10-year period. During that same time, there was a series of hurricanes hitting the Caribbean. So there was a notion that the climate of the Caribbean region is changing in ways that seem to signal the emergence of a new climate regime. This is the Jamaican climate scientist Michael Taylor writing in 2017 that there is something unfamiliar about the Caribbean's climate today. And that is because of the frequency and the intensity of hurricanes that were being experienced, with Hurricane Matthew hitting Haiti in October 2016 with a very strong impact on the southwest of the country. And then, of course, Hurricanes Irma and Maria, which came back to back in September 2017 in this very unusual sort of convergence of two major 5.0 hurricanes that hit many islands. And in particularly Puerto Rico was very hard hit, as you know, by Hurricane Maria, and then Hurricane Dorian in 2019, which razed entire communities in the Grand Bahamas and the Abacos, and was the most intense tropical storm ever to hit the Bahamas. So all of that was going on as I was kind of trying to write this book on Island Futures. And that's what was informing my thinking about, why the subtitle is Caribbean Survival in the Anthropocene. So having introduced that sort of historical time period, I want to go a little bit into some of the themes of the book. And I begin with the preface, which is called Autobiography of My Mother. My mother died in 2018 as I was doing this work and thinking about these issues. And I realized in reflecting on that experience that she had been the person who had really inspired my interest in Haiti, in Jamaica, in the Caribbean, through her work as a political activist. She was a school teacher in the Philadelphia public school system, doing special education. She taught autistic children for her entire career. And she was also involved in activism. And these are t-shirts from a display she did for her 75th birthday, which was it was called My Life in T-shirts. And it was all the protest t-shirts that she had worn to different events. Stop the US war in El Salvador, back to the 1980s, Democracia en el País y en la Casa, the transnational feminist movements, peace movements, anti-gun violence movements. And in her papers after her death, I found a letter that she had written to a local newspaper. She was the secretary for the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom in the Germantown, Philadelphia. And in 1994, she got this letter published in the paper called Haitian History Reveals the Following. And in the letter, it talks about the US Marines occupying Haiti in 1915 and staying there for 19 years and leaving a legacy of economic exploitation, decimation of resisting farmers, who were the group known as the Cacos, who tried to resist the US occupation, a weakened civil society, and a solidified proxy army known as the Haitian Armed Forces. And she wrote, the US consistently used political, economic, and military means to suppress Haitian democratic efforts, and how the US funding supported the dictatorships of the Duvaliers, of Raul Cedras, and money channeled through the Agency for International Development and the National Endowment for Democracy co-opted progressive grassroots organizations. So this was a sort of political discourse that I kind of grew up around as a teenager. This is what I was understanding. And there were activists coming from Haiti to speak in Philadelphia who were sharing this information, critiquing US economic and political institutions that had used Haiti as a low-wage export platform, as they say here. And then she went on to talk about how Aristide, President Jean-Bertrand Aristide, had won the election on a revolutionary platform that preached against exploitation of workers and defied the politically protected drug cartels. So again, this was this election in the 1980s that was this opening of democracy in Haiti, but it was stopped, and there was a coup in 1991, and the United States did not remove the coup leaders. It was not, US policy was not designed to do so. And there was subsequently a restoration of Aristide, and then a second coup against him, or removal of him from office in 2004. And basically the US government supported this. So how are we connected to this history and these events in Haiti, and how do they bring us up to the present history and what's happening today? In 2004, Aristide had presented a $22 billion bill for reparations to the French government. And it was based on the argument that France had forced Haiti to pay this indemnity after the Haitian Revolution, and that extracted from the Haitian National Treasury this payment of 150 million francs, which happened between 1825 and 1893, and it was calculated in current terms then as $40 billion. And so his argument was that they need to pay that back. When we say Haiti's the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, it's because this wealth was extracted from Haiti. What fewer people know is that that debt shifted to the United States. And in the 1890s, Haiti's entire treasury was placed under the direct supervision of a French bank, which then was shifted over to the National City Bank, which is today's Citibank. And literally they moved the gold from Haiti to a vault on Wall Street. And it was this fighting over the payments around this debt that led to the US occupation in 1915. It was to protect US finance capital. And Haitian debts to this American banking system were not paid off until 1947. So there's this long history of the Haitian Revolution being undermined by the United States, being challenged, and then this debt repayment, and then in more recent political times, this attempt for Haiti to reposition itself, again, undermining Aristide's regime because of that sort of political position. So I say all that to set up my personal kind of political history and relationship with Haiti. And my first actual visit to Haiti was in 1997 on a trip that was called a study tour organized by the Haiti Support Group, which is a London-based organization still active today. And a group of us went there from the UK. It was not a long trip, it was just a couple of weeks, but they introduced us to a whole range of civil society, grassroots political organizations. We met a leader named Chavan Jean-Baptiste of Tête Collée Ti Paysanne Haïtienne. We met members of the Mouvement Paysan de Papaye. And this word paysan, it means peasant, but it means like small farmer. And it dates back to that history I mentioned of the Piquet Rebellion. That is the people who had been enslaved, who fought the revolution, who won the revolution, but found that they still needed to fight for freedom, and like that the government and the elites were still controlling the country. So, 150 years on, this fight was still going on. We met Camille Chalmers of the Haitian Platform for Alternative Development. We met Rosanne Auguste from a women's health clinic. And that kind of laid the groundwork for me to recognize that the current politics of Haiti were grounded in these struggles over this long period of time and were still ongoing. And what was so striking is that when I returned after the 2010 earthquake, many of these same leaders were still organizing. They were organizing against the UN, what they saw as an occupation by the UN. They were organizing against the arrival of US troops in the country after the earthquake. And they were trying to form the civil society kind of response to the rebuilding effort. And it's not a story we were really hearing in the US. We were hearing about foreign NGOs, international aid coming to the country. We weren't hearing about the people within the country who were trying to organize. And so for me, this is a paradigm shift from thinking not about aid, as people do after disasters, but liberation. What does it mean to think of liberation? And while I was on this study tour in 1997, we interviewed leaders of Tête Collée Paysanne, and they said, and it's published in this book, a Haiti anthology, Liberté, edited by Charles Arthur and the late J. Michael Dash. Charles Arthur led the study tour we were on, and we all compiled our notes as part of the publication of this book. And so I have the original notes from this interview, which I noted down, and they said, we want a state that is not a puppet of the Blancs. And the Blanc means foreigners, but it also, technically it means white, but it refers to any foreigners. And by this we mean, they said, foreign powers. Blanc means the US government, the World Bank, the IMF, all enforcing their own economic and political plans on the world. We want a state that really welcomes participation of the popular masses in real power. We want democratic participation in its real essence, not demagogy and intimidation. And it's interesting, when I heard them say that, I heard echoes of the research I was doing on the archives from the 19th century. That is what the Piquet rebels were saying. That was what the Jamaicans in the Morant Bay Rebellion were saying. That was what people in the US were saying after Reconstruction and its, the rollback in what was called Southern Redemption. And in 2010, I returned to Haiti and I was involved in research, which I'll talk about in a minute, interviewing people in Léogâne, said all the Blancs should leave, all the foreign NGOs should go. This was during this effort to help people and bring aid and rebuild after the earthquake. They were still saying that. And today, to bring it full circle, we hear the same call after the assassination of President Jovenel Moïse in very murky circumstances in July of 2021, last July, a kind of ongoing constitutional crisis around the US backing of the current sort of interim government of Prime Minister Ariel Henry, and a government that's widely considered illegitimate. And the groups that have been organizing for all of these decades against this kind of US intervention in the country, they are trying to form a constitutional process to lead towards elections and a new constitution and a reconstruction, a true democratic reconstruction of Haiti. And that's not what the US is currently backing with the Henry government. So mixed into this whole tale of this story is, of course, that in 2021, we saw in the media here the migration crisis, as it might be described, where US border agents on horses stopped the group of up to 14,000 Haitians who had come leaving Brazil, Latin America, Chile, other countries, walking and getting transport up all the way through Central America and Mexico, arriving at Del Rio, Texas. And they were blocked from entering the country. And these 14,000 people, many with young children, were forced to camp under a highway overpass. Many had lived in Latin American countries since 2010, so over a decade, and the economic and the COVID crisis had driven them out of those countries. And the Biden administration deported thousands of these Haitians during the political crisis that was occurring before, running up to and after the assassination of President Moïse in July. So this very inhumane treatment of Haitians who were forced into this kind of period of migration and movement and instability with nowhere to go. And they were deported back, of course, in the midst of COVID as well, right? And people who were infected with COVID were forced onto flights and deportation. And I want to say that it's not just the US that is involved in this. So when Hurricane Dorian struck the Bahamas in 2019, as Angelique Nixon has written, it was Haitian migrants and Haitian Bahamians who were the most vulnerable and marginalized communities in the Bahamas. And they're too often ignored and treated inhumanely by the state and Bahamians generally. It's likely that many undocumented Haitian migrants in Abuco were too scared to even seek shelter and evacuate when they knew the hurricane was coming. And we'll never know how many of those people actually died in Hurricane Dorian. At the very moment, the week or two after the hurricane, organizations like this one shown on the right organized meetings to discuss what they called the topic, eradicating illegal immigrants in the Bahamas, Shanty Towns Down. This was an event held at the Church of God of Prophecy. So Bahamian organizations and churches also are pushing out Haitians, right? The US is pushing them out. The Caribbean countries are pushing them out. The Latin American countries are pushing them out. So how do we understand all these events? How can we make sense of this? And how can we do something to improve this situation? And I draw on some work that talks about these earthquakes and these hurricanes as not so natural disasters. So although we saw the climate scientists say that the current climate is unfamiliar and unprecedented, that doesn't imply that it does not have historical roots. That is, it is an unnatural disaster or a not so natural disaster, which is to say that vulnerability is not simply a product of natural conditions. It is a political state and a colonial condition, as Yarimar Bonilla argued in the Washington Post. Many now refer to these seemingly natural hazards, such as hurricanes and earthquakes, as unnatural disasters because of the ways in which risk and vulnerability are structured by all too human structures of inequality. And as April Baptiste and Kevin Riney have argued, the marginalized groups experience climate change effects, and we could say earthquakes too, differently from the wealthy and privileged. And this has to be addressed from a political and an ethical perspective. So this is the sort of project, when I look back on my work from Democracy After Slavery all the way up to Island Futures, it's in a way inspired by a Du Boisian question, that is inspired by W.E.B. Du Bois, and in particular his book, Black Reconstruction in America, which I read as a graduate student while I was working on my PhD, to ask the question, if we take his arguments about Black Reconstruction in America, and we think about the way we talk about Caribbean Reconstruction, right, after these disasters, what kinds of futures are imagined in and entailed by post-disaster reconstruction? What would radical reconstruction in the Caribbean look like, to echo Du Bois, if it were to actually reconstruct the bases of racial capitalism and instead create a truly popular democracy? How can reparations for slavery and climate reparations perhaps be combined into a radical Caribbean reconstruction? And I believe these are the questions that the popular movements, the grassroots movements, the peasant movements, as they're described in Haiti, they have been asking that question, right? Since slavery ended, since the 19th century, and they're still asking that question now. And we need to ask ourselves that question as well. And here I just want to quote Malini Ranganathan and Eve Bratman on the concept of abolition democracy. They talk about an approach to climate justice rooted in abolitionism that seeks to address racism and climate-induced harm together. And they say, just as Du Bois's notion of abolition democracy was attentive to the interconnected spheres that were and are necessary to achieve unfinished Black emancipation after the end of slavery, an abolitionist approach to climate justice demands attention to historical reparations and intersectional processes, not just those to do with climate, but also to do with housing, policing, food security, and a kind of reparative humanism. This is a kind of intersectional thinking, and it links together these different longer historical traumas and events with the current questions around Reconstruction. So let me shift gears now, and I'll just say a little bit about the research I did after the earthquake in 2010, because I went back to Haiti with a group of engineers from Drexel University, and we had an NSF rapid grant called Supporting Haitian Infrastructure Reconstruction with Local Knowledge. And we trained a team of these 6 Haitian University students to conduct surveys across the area of Léogâne, the city and the surrounding areas. We also did semi-structured interviews with people ranging from fishermen and farmers to local professionals and the mayor. We conducted other interviews with foreign NGO staff, water agency managers, government officials, and we were trying to gather this sort of picture of how was Reconstruction taking place, in particular around water and sanitation, which was the sort of focus of the engineering expertise that we had there. And in particular, we organized a workshop where we invited 76 participants who represented 40 local community organizations in the Léogâne area. And we provided the facility. This was actually at a high school, and we got microphones, we got lunch, we got transportation and everything, and materials, and asked people to discuss amongst themselves what their ideas were for the reconstruction of water and sanitation systems and anything else they thought needed to be included. And they held breakout groups and discussions, they voted on ideas, and then they took the ideas to a plenary, held further breakout groups, voted, and kind of came up with these long lists of ideas of what should be done. The whole event was held in Creole, and we recorded all the notes and came back later with a report, which we returned to the country later and reported back to the water agency and the mayor and the NGOs, like, you know, the findings of these organizations. But that was the sort of project, but it led me to reflect on it over the years as we saw that these kinds of groups, these kinds of people were not included in the reconstruction effort, in the decision-making, in the planning. Instead, it was driven by these NGOs who arrived from all over the world with their own agendas, their own initiatives, their own ideas of what they could do and how things could be done. And they didn't include the Haitian people, and they didn't include Haitian civil society, Haitian organizations. And to me, this was part of the failure of this post-earthquake reconstruction. And over that 10-year period of reflecting on it, I came to the writing of this book, Island Futures. And I'm just gonna kind of, I want to save plenty of time for questions. So I just want to talk about a little bit about the chapters in the book without using all of our time. So I'll go through this quickly. but the book is organized around, each chapter is on a different kind of power. And I talk about kinopolitical power in chapter 1, by which I mean the power of mobility, of who moves, how we move, what privileges of mobility do some people exercise, and what kind of assemblages of mobility, of technology, of infrastructure are mobilized by different groups of people in this post-earthquake reconstruction effort. And here you see an image of motorcycle riders, right? These are moto taxis. They were a very popular form of transportation for many people. Alongside you might have known of the buses that are called tap-tap buses, which are sort of trucks that are converted to hold benches with people squeezed into them. But the moto taxis you'll see are driven by men. Many of the riders are women. In the background here, you see a UN truck, that is the UN peacekeepers traveled around in these large trucks, and you'd often see armed troops in this case, they were from Brazil during this period of the MINUSTA peacekeeping force. On the right, you see a MINUSTA base, which is, you can see, fenced off, kind of fortified, and has its own communication infrastructure. I myself took these pictures from the comfort of an air-conditioned SUV, right? I rolled down the window, snapped the picture. It was hot out, it was dusty out, and I rolled it back up again. And there's a lot of implications of these different power relations of how we move around. And so I talk about the ways in which the humanitarian response gave privileged people with kinopolitical power the ability to fly in and out, to get vehicles, to be in places with electricity and clean water, while most Haitians, after the earthquake, did not have that privilege, that access to that kind of freedom of mobility. And I talk about this in terms of what I call the islanding effect. That is, that disasters lay bare these mobility regimes that are about uneven distribution of social rights to movement, of the network capital it takes to be able to move, and of these constellations of mobility and infrastructure. So that after the disaster of an earthquake or, say, a hurricane knocks out normal everyday infrastructure, the logistics that brings some people to help also produces disconnections. It limits the capability for mobility of the victims of the disaster. And I call this the islanding effect, which held Haitians in place while outsiders could come and go. Through the disaster response itself, we were creating new immobility infrastructures that were deepening inequalities, diminishing mobility justice, and reproducing subjects, people with differential capabilities for movement. And so I was developing my work on mobility justice during this time, and post-disaster situations really can focus our attention on this question of containment and kinopolitical power. And when you look at then the subsequent waves that I showed earlier of migration and displacement of Haitians, it's part of that kinopolitical power. That is, it extends from that encounter on a street to the UN troops who were there, to the humanitarians, to the borders that kind of force Haitians back into this situation in which they find themselves. Chapter 2 of the book is about water power. And I talk about I'll just give one example here. The center picture is a water kiosk that was a solar-powered water filtration system installed by an Oxfam organization in a small town that when I was back in Haiti in 2012, our team of engineers, we were back on a different research project. We visited, we saw this, it says Comité de l'eau, water committee, and we went to check out the water and there was no water. It wasn't running. And it was supposed to be providing rainwater and filtering it with a solar panel and through all this complex technology. So we asked for a key to unlock the door to see if the engineers could maybe solve the problem and fix it. Open the door, and inside is the picture on the left, which was a whole pile of cell phones and laptop computers that were being powered off of the solar panel. So whatever had happened here, they had repurposed the water kiosk and instead were using it as a lockable, safe, secure charging station for a lot of equipment. And so I tell the story about that in the book and sort of question what humanitarians think they're doing when they do stuff like build stuff like that, and how it fits into the actual local cultural context. There's a chapter on aerial power where I look at the air space that occurs around the disaster and the recovery efforts and the military occupations and who has power to be in the air, to do visual data from the air, to collect satellite imagery from the air. And in particular, as the book unfolded, I wanted to bring the voices of Haitian-led reconstruction and development to the foreground. So in March 2010, this group of Haitian-led thinkers, responders, they talked about how massive humanitarian aid is indispensable, but should be deployed in terms of a different vision of the reconstruction process. It should break from the paradigms that dominate international aid. And they wanted to see international brigades working with their organizations and working on things like agrarian reform and integrated urban land reform, struggling against illiteracy, for reforestation, universal systems of education and public health. And they were angry, as I said earlier, at the arrival of 20,000 US Marines in the country and what they called a new military occupation by US troops. This was some of the groups involved in that coalition. And again, some of the same groups that I met back in 1997 were here on this coalition criticizing what was happening after the earthquake. And none of these kind of, again, civil society, grassroots, feminist and peasant organizations were included in the reconstruction decision-making. And that was one of the biggest sort of reasons why it failed, I believe. In a chapter on digital power, I also, again, look at this unequal inclusion and the way in which the islanding effect was also a digital islanding effect. And even things like open street maps that were used to sort of map information about the earthquake were not accessible to Haitian people. So the digital islanding effect is about, again, the way the global humanitarian supply chain mobilizes for disaster in ways that demobilize and contain local recipients of aid, both spatially and politically and digitally. Later in 2012, as I said, I returned with a different research group of engineers. And in this case, we came to study climate change and the flooding of two lakes on the Haitian-Dominican border. And so this was a different project, but tied in to the previous work after the earthquake. And in this case was about a slower developing disaster of the flooding of Lake Azuay in Haiti and Lac Enriquillo in the Dominican Republic. And here you can see the flooding of the roadway, the flooding of the farmland, and the question in that chapter, it's a story about, again, the role of our research team in crossing this border and really reflecting on our kinopolitical power, but also our lack of power, which is interesting, and the sort of structural holes within the state. And then finally, there's a chapter on sexual power, or the abuse of power through sex, for which I give a picture here of, on the one hand, Bill Clinton, who literally showed up one day. I was in Leogane. I was studying a WASH cluster UN meeting. I was on the UN base, and he arrives out of nowhere, like, oh, like, Bill, what are you doing here in Haiti? And it was a reminder of the power of a certain kind of mobility, a certain kind of masculine mobility and presidential mobility. Of this picture are some of the security guards at the mayor of Leogán's office. Oh, excuse me too if my internet connection is a little bit unstable. So Bill Clinton was the co-chair of the Interim Haiti Recovery Commission. The guys in the mayor's office were reminders to me of the kind of informal military forces. So you have the UN forces, but then you have these many armed men. And after the earthquake, what we learned in particular from Haitian women's organizations was the amount of sexual exploitation and violence that was occurring. And in this report called the Haiti Gender Shadow Report, the coalition wrote about the urgent need to address violence, domestic violence, labor and sex trafficking, sexual exploitation, elder abuse, and other gender-based human rights violations. And multiple reports existed across the camps of internally displaced people, of rapes occurring, but also involvement of members of the National Haitian Police and of the UN peacekeeping forces known as MINUSTA in these human rights abuses and sexual and gender-based violence. And during this period, it came out that Sri Lankan peacekeepers who were stationed in Haiti were abusing hundreds of children who were forced to exchange sex in exchange for meals, just for food. And this was supposed to be the humanitarian response. And then it came to light that leaders of Oxfam were involved in hiring sex workers and prostitutes in what was called an orgy, and they ended up being kicked out of the country. So there was this running through this whole period was this sense of impunity and abuse and gender-based violence and sexual violence and human trafficking that was happening. And it was also linked to the fact that in the Dominican Republic, there was a lot of activity around sex tourism. And so the people who were coming to Haiti, who were supposed to be helping reconstruct, were engaged in this kind of activity. So I just want to kind of bring some of what I'm saying to a close and talk about how throughout the chapters of the book, each one is actually also linked to the force of one of the lois of voodoo. And running through the book is this sense of other kinds of power and other deeper cultural ways of understanding what was going on. And so I use these songs that give a kind of lament and a different way of thinking and acting through. This one is for the Loi Erzili, and you know, it sort of reminds us of the limitations of our own social scientific ways of understanding the world. So to conclude, I just want to say a little bit about learning from Caribbean civil society organizations about just recoveries. And I draw on a whole history of Caribbean thinkers who have talked about Caribbean temporalities and futurity. So Sylvia Wynter's important work, thinking, theorizing the human after man, Critchlow and Northover's work on vexed temporality and what they call ongoing states of emergency, Catherine McKittrick's important geographies of demonic grounds, Aaron Kamagish's work beyond Caribbean coloniality. And for me, all of these are thinking about how we might imagine alternative post-development futures for the entire region. And after hurricanes or after the slower violence of ongoing extractive economies and climate change, how can we allow a thought for building food sovereignty and security, protecting water sources, protecting coastal areas and fisheries? I was drawing here on the work around Puerto Rico after Hurricane Irma and Maria on the idea of just recovery and how thousands of people tried to come together to design bold and holistic plans for the island to be rebuilt, to be more resilient to climate change, and how it was rooted also, as in Haiti, in a critique of the exploitation of the island's people and land as a bottomless raw resource, right? The extractive economies. So in envisioning alternative futures, after Hurricane Maria, we saw the forming of people's assemblies, offering mutual aid and engaging in community planning, arguments that aid money should go directly to Puerto Rican organizations and communities. And these are the same arguments I was arriving at about what happened in Haiti and the Haitian Reconstruction, is that it should have been people-led, it should have concentrated on food sovereignty, and it should have given the aid money directly to the affected communities. And for me, this is grounded in the thinking around the counter plantation that is Haitian sociologist Jean Casimir has developed this concept to describe the practices of land and labor struggle, and forms of counter plantation life have included maroon settlements in colonial and revolutionary Saint-Domingue, guerrilla soldiers called the Cacos who fought the US occupation in the early 20th century. And I would add the Piquet movement that I referred to in the 1840s, and the peasant movements that continue to flourish in Haiti today. And this counter-plantation ideology still exists. And there's a great recent book by Eveline Alexis called Haiti Fights Back, which is the life and legacy of Charlemagne Perrault, who was the leader of the Cacos during the resistance to the US occupation, and who is still lauded as a hero amongst these popular organizations. So ultimately, I believe that for Haitian Futures and Haitian Reconstruction, we need to break the cycle of extractive economies, fossil fuel and tourism dependence, labor exploitation, and unsustainability, and learn from the agroecological projects and the peasant movements and the people's movements how to expand regenerative low-till agriculture, multi-strata agroforestry, tree intercropping, and use of tropical staple crops, staple trees in these multi-crop gardening systems known in the ancient Arawak language as Kanuko, and the plants that are still used, many of them come out of indigenous traditions as well, and others that have moved around the world, such as breadfruit trees, for example. And Haitian peasant movements were involved in the forming of Via Campesina, which created the concept of food sovereignty, which is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound, sustainable methods, and prioritizing local economies and markets. And all of this is to say that these alternative formations are what Haitian movements have been struggling for a long time. And they are what are still being undermined by US policy in the region. And we need to demand the immediate payment by the US, the UK, and the EU of slavery reparations and climate reparations to the entire region. We need to learn from the agroecological projects to create forms of collective landholding, harness solar and renewable energy, for example, in community-owned microgrids, to open communication technology in ways that would connect people across the Caribbean and its diaspora, allow for easier movement between places, develop ultimately what I call mobile commons that enable people to mobilize energy, resources, human labor in ways that are more respectful of limits, respectful of each other, respectful of plants, animals, earth, water, and the spiritual and more than human entities that inform Haitian cultural life. And I will stop sharing there with an image of Dessalines, who is still considered, he was the great leader of Haitian independence and the revolution after Toussaint Louverture was assassinated by Napoleon's kidnapping of him. And on the left, you see an image of a contemporary Haitian young man dressed as Dessalines and confronting troops that are occupying the country. So thank you. And I'm really looking forward to your questions and comments and discussion.
Thank you so much for really insightful and thoroughgoing presentation, Mimi. Enjoyed it quite a bit. Give you a minute to maybe grab a drink of water while folks start to think about questions.
Thanks.
And I think given the numbers of us that are here, it might just make sense to raise your hand if you have a question for Mimi.
Yeah,
Tim,
Timothy.
you're up.
Hey there. Sorry, I got my camera off. I have my daughter over here and she's moving around. But I caught you. I enjoyed listening to your talk. I caught you on the New Books Network the other day too for a conversation on the book. So that was
Yeah.
a very nice conversation. You had mentioned National Endowment for Democracy at the beginning and USAID and whatnot. I was curious if do you have any sense of what they're up to these days in Haiti, do you find, and if so, do you find that they mostly work with political parties, or do you find that, for instance, in recent years, there's been, as I'm sure like in Cuba and in Venezuela, for instance, there's like funding of cultural projects like bands, hip hop groups, and this type of thing. I was curious if you ever encountered any of those sorts of projects in recent years. I don't know if, of course, a lot of these groups, don't publish what they're up to. Yeah, I just wasn't sure if you encountered any of that.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I have to admit, I have not done the research on that, and I haven't seen recent reporting on that or research on that. So I'm sorry, I can't answer the question of what exactly National Endowment for Democracy or USAID are up to right now. One fascinating reporting that came out, this is not exactly on that topic, but on the events since the assassination of Jovenel Moïse, right? Jake Johnston, who works for the Center for Economic Policy Research, published a piece, and he's been someone who's been writing about Haitian politics for a long time, trying to investigate who was involved in that assassination. And it traces back some links that do tie back to the involvement of US, I guess, right-wing political organizations that had funded certain groups back in the period of Aristide's removal. And there was someone who was involved in the assassination of a major journalist in Haiti named Jean Dominique. And that was in 2004. And the person involved in that assassination of Jean Dominique may also have been involved in the assassination of Jovenel Moïse, which is to say, over this 20-year period, I talked about the sort of resistance movements, the opposition movements, but the people on the other side who are driving the kind of contestation amongst certain political elites, they also have been at it for 20 years. So there's deep ties there.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, Paul.
Well, this was terrific. I really enjoyed it, and I think, despite it being a busy week, I think some people missed out on opportunity to hear a lot, and it fits so well with our theme also of the connections between the U.S. and other parts of the world that people don't think about. And I think I wanted to pick up on two different parts of that. One is this arrival at the border of Mexico and the U.S. of these 14,000 Haitians, because I think it felt really mysterious from the U.S. media side, how thousands of Haitians who had been living in various parts of Latin America, whether they were organized, whether they were funded, how it was that a large group were suddenly joining other groups of migrants who had been coming previously from Honduras and other parts of Central America. So that's one, whether you could provide some insight sort of into that. The other is, you know, a lot of what you touched on to me were longstanding problems in aid and participation, and sort of struggles to make them more participatory. And I guess I'm going to ask a question that I hope would have a positive answer, but I'm not confident would, which is whether any of these organizations have been impacted by work by yourself and colleagues in your networks to sort of move away from calling the post-earthquake reconstruction a failure due to whatever domestic factors that are usually get blamed, and to actually you know, improve what they're doing. And you know, it's something that also I, you know, sometimes get asked by students too, like where are the good groups? And you know, if Oxfam is involved in the kinds of activities you just described, that's horrific. And you know, Doctors Without Borders, as far as I know, still has a fairly good reputation. But you know, sort of, what do you think? Are there any larger organizations that are doing any kind of this more participatory model? Is it possible really for large aid organizations to engage in the kind of participation that you showed us?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me first answer quickly the question about the migrants, because I am not an expert on that. I am going to refer you in the chat to the work of Henderson Joseph, who is a really doing really interesting research, because he's a PhD in social anthropology at University of Rio de Janeiro, and an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology, and works on border studies, and in particular on Haitian migrants in Brazil, but also you know, as they cross up to the Mexico-US border. So check out his publications on that topic. He
Okay,
knows way
thanks.
more about it than I do. How they left, how they got there, how they moved, all that stuff. So on the question of, yeah, what organizations are doing good? So it's a complicated question. And the first thing I would begin by saying is if it were me, I would give, if I were wanting to donate or help or whatever in some situation, go to the local organizations run by local people, right? Don't begin with the Red Cross or the, you know, whatever. And I mean, all right, Doctors Without Borders does, you know, important work, albeit medical work. And so too, Partners in Health. I mean, and you guys, you probably know Paul Farmer, the founder, just died. And it's really sad. And I've known about his work for a long time, and the work he did in creating not just hospitals in Haiti, but building an entire infrastructure of medical training, et cetera. But what I also learned in his obituaries in the past week was that he was inspired by liberation theology, and that he lived an incredibly humble life, according to commentators, and committed himself to service to the poor, basically. And so that's interesting to think about. Okay, if you want to get involved, reflect on your position of power and your positionality in general. And how are you taking advantage or getting advantage from what you're doing? And are you really putting the poor first, or those affected first, those most harmed? Are you putting them first? So start from there, like start from that reflective piece, and then look at the organization you're working with and ask, are they doing that? Are they reflecting on that? How are they acting in the world? Who are they paying? How much are they paid? How are they traveling? Where are they staying? It turned out Paul Farmer never stayed at hotels and never went to a restaurant in Haiti. He stayed with local contacts and ate, you know, local home-cooked meals, I guess. And most aid agencies don't work that way. And the Oxfam leaders who were, using prostitutes were in a fancy hotel, right? And one of the things I reflect on in the book is that even as we moved around to do this research, were we bringing harm to people because we were exposing them to people with power, people who had cars, who were foreigners, who had more money, and who could, in the case I gave in the Dominican Republic, could sort of lure young women and children to leave their home because they could get a ride to town. And a ride to town can easily turn into, I say, trafficking begins in traffic. You need a ride somewhere. Men have cars and motorcycles. Where does that lead to? And so we, even as researchers, as we were using rides to get to small rural places where people didn't have vehicles, were we exposing them to that? So each of us needs to reflect on that. And it's not like, oh, here's this one good organization and just work with them. I would say, do the work to think through what you're doing and how you're doing it.
And I think that's helpful. I guess if I could just add one quick follow-up, I guess I'm just wondering whether, like, not just can we be self-reflective and think about that, but how can we, or who can pressure organizations like UN or Oxfam or whoever, many are religiously organized or motivated organizations. And you mentioned the Bahamian one that's anti-immigrant in the Bahamas. How can one push other groups to be self-reflective in the ways you're talking about?
Yeah, right. And, I hope that more students who are studying this subject, right, go and want to go into this field, maybe work for these organizations and bring in transformative paradigms. So learn about it and then spread the word about it, right? We each need to do our part. And if we're interested in working with these kinds of global organizations, humanitarian organizations, can we bring that to the work? And we're each responsible for that. And it's like, it's going to be a slow process of transformation as new understandings of these challenges are, I think, brought to the table, brought inside, and work on transforming the organizations from inside. Because the power network of these organizations is not transforming itself. And that's why so many Haitians said, we just want you to leave. Just let us figure it out ourselves. Because they understood that no matter what the name of the organization, the mission of the organization, what it said it was doing, it was distorting what people there were able to do for themselves.
I have a question which I think follows on Paul's question, which is also a question to kind of ask you about some of your other work that you didn't get to present on today. So first, I mean, I think part of your response is, as I took it from your other book, Consuming the Caribbean, right? That we need to engage Caribbean with a kind of a research ethic, but also a kind of epistemological ethic that sort of centers it in the way we think about, the world ecology. And so my question is, could you say a bit more about like the ways in which you see the case of Haiti, which is sort of problematically represented as, this perpetually and always forever failed state, how really interrogating that kind of construct and the way that we consume that logic might also be a part of a broader call to rethink the Caribbean, right? And I'm thinking about the way you, for me, part of your answer comes like in the way you talked about aluminum dreams. So, and if you could say something about that as well.
Yeah, so, I think we often think of the Caribbean as a tourist destination and as a place of these kind of islands, which on the one hand are alluring and attractive, beaches and palm trees and that kind of thing. I mean, it's so stereotypical. And then on the other extreme, poverty, violence, the problems. And those things get repeated sort of over and over again in how the region is represented. And yet most people have very little, most North Americans or Europeans for that matter, who travel there as tourists and as humanitarians, have very little knowledge and understanding of Caribbean history, culture, diversity of cultures. At best, maybe we are exposed a little bit to like music and food cultures, and we know a little bit about that. Maybe we've talked to some Caribbean diaspora folks and we've learned a little about that, but most of us don't have a good sense of that historical, geographical, political economy, right, that the region is built on. Like, why is it what it is? Why are those people there? How are they connected to us? And so what I was trying to do, both in Consuming the Caribbean and Aluminum Dreams, was to look at those connections through material cultures, through the circulation of goods, of like I said, of commodity crops, but also of bauxite or aluminum, and of cultural representations as well, and how our cultures are connected. And everything that we think of as modern and technology and speed and lightness of airplanes and satellites and all of that kind of high tech, it's built out of this counter image of these backwards and tropical, island places that are slow and that are, dysfunctional in some ways, unlike our modern, sleek technology. And yet those things are completely intertwined. They are co-produced together, those narratives and those images. So it's a way of, I guess, bringing in a kind of, I call it cultural political economy, into understanding our relationship, the relationships between the Caribbean and the North Atlantic, as well as I think I would love to see more work, future grad students, on relations within the Caribbean region with each other, because there's a lot of circulating ideas that are putting people at odds with each other, and they're not, the region needs unity. It needs greater support of each other. And I, one of the things that worries me most sometimes is like that we don't see enough of that. We see conflict and we see criticism of each other.
Yeah, I don't want this to become just a conversation between me and you, but I think your last point is particularly relevant. I think right now, one of the persons implicated in the assassination plot, his family is seeking asylum in Jamaica. And the popular response in Jamaica, as folks here who look at the region might know, is not surprising in that it repeats some of these kind of very racist, anti-Haitian kind of discourses, which is not unique to Jamaica, right? And I'm thinking about when Jamaicans and Haitians were going to Cuba to work in the 1910s, 1920s. We saw that happen. And so, yeah, I think that point is well taken. So thank you for your answer.
Yeah, and similar tensions between the Afro-Guyanese and Indo-Guyanese, that complex political history now exacerbated by this extractive economy, right, of fossil fuel, right, oil drilling, and how that is like tearing apart the region and has drastic climate impacts associated with it. Yeah, Maya.
Yeah, hi, I am a student in sustainability, and it was really interesting to me to hear about like the agroecology part of it and like agroforestry and everything. I remember I took a class last semester called How to Feed the World, and it was a really great class. And we had to write like a short paper about Haiti and challenges to food security and stuff. And a thing that I saw was that there's like been a shift in nutrition. So like the diets are shifting from due to globalization and due to like trade and everything. So Haitians are less willing to eat like native indigenous foods and are transitioning more to eating like more processed foods that's imported from like US and other places. And I was wondering like the suitability of then expanding different like sustainable ag or like agroecology and growing like indigenous foods. And if you've noticed that kind of transition where people are less willing to eating that like not like native food, if that makes sense. And it's just so interesting to me because I want to expand those types of things, but it's also like I can see those challenges to like current diets and nutrition.
Yeah, that's such a good question. It's such a, food culture is such an interesting topic, and there's so much complexity to it in terms of imported foods and native foods. I was thinking in particular of disaster resistant foods, right? As climate changes and as hurricanes come, right? The root crops survive a hurricane, right? When everything else gets blown away, you can still dig up a yam, right? And really interestingly, also, I just learned that that there were recent earthquakes in Haiti again, right? In the summer, and they're down in the southwest, in Jeremy and Okay were affected, and that one of the really successful efforts in responding to the earthquake was a bakery that's using breadfruit to make you make breadfruit from a breadfruit tree, which has very productive, like huge amounts of really highly nutritious fruit on it. It can be turned into a flour, and the flour is baked into these little cakes, which with really nice flavorings like ginger and vanilla and anise added to them, right? And they sound really yummy. And they've been feeding like thousands of people by making these cakes. And like, what a great opportunity to both get food to people, improve the small business. The small business that's making the cakes can actually get the profit from distributing them, right? And preserve the trees, grow the trees, plant more of the trees, which they had been doing these trees over like a 10-year period, kind of building up towards them. So compare that to an American saying, I'm going to pack up this box of, peanut butter and ship it to Haiti or put it on an airplane, and then it's going to be trucked out. Like, that makes no sense. Yeah. So I was coming at it from that perspective. And the same in Puerto Rico is that a lot of community-based organizations and people's groups are trying to rebuild that kind of, again, that idea of food sovereignty. And it's hard work because a lot of the Caribbean is urbanized and people are not on the land, right? And they do not practice those traditions, and they might look down on that, right? Across much of the Caribbean, people don't want to be farmers, but at the same time, there are small movements of going back to the land and of farming. So I would say there's people in their 20s who are, most of the farmers were like aging out, getting older and older. This is happening around the world. Everyone's urbanized. Everybody wants to be a city slicker. So how do you get people to like grow food again? And when you're faced with a disaster where you're cut off from your food source, you kind of appreciate it. I think, again, you realize, oh yeah, we do need to be able to grow food. That would be helpful. And if we had renewable energy, if we had solar power, if we had a microgrid, when the power system in Puerto Rico was completely wiped out by the hurricane, it was the groups that had those microgrids that were able to get power back on most quickly. So it's going to take work. I mean, and it does mean changing food habits. It means revaluing those natural foods, indigenous foods. I mean, in Jamaica, you can have the advantage of building on Rastafarian food cultures and Ital food, right? Which is a healthy, natural, local foods. And so like the culture exists. It's just how do we big it up?
Love that. Big it up. It's sort of these are the cultures of the plot, right? The cultures of the provision ground, cultures of
Yeah.
Caribbean folk history.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And, you know, we see a huge movement for Black farming, right, across the Americas, but here in the US, right, Black farming is having a moment and reclaiming land and fighting to get the federal government subsidies back that have gone to white farmers and not to Black farmers. I mean, it takes a fight to get the land back, and it takes land distribution too. And also urban farming and hydroponic farming. And there's many possibilities, and there are many small organizations that are doing that kind of work.
I think we've got time for a few more questions or comments.
And I just wanted to add to Maya also that of course, as you said, the processed foods, right, it links to people's health and well-being, right? So many people with diabetes and, you know, other diet-related illnesses in the Caribbean because they've been cut off from the natural and healthier sort of food systems. And I mean, that's a global problem, but I feel like the solutions we need for democratization, equality, justice, climate, environment, sustainability, as well as gender equality, right? A lot of it can be solved by the same set of actions, right? By rebuilding that kind of culture that's grounded in life and in growth and in health, right? Begins from the land and the food we eat.
Nobody else is hopping in. I'll hop back in with one thing. You mentioned at the end of kind of lovely answer, and I'm also, thanks Maya, I'm so glad that students are speaking up and asking questions in here. It's great. And you mentioned hydroponic, and you also mentioned several times in your presentation going on trips with engineers, and now you're at a Polytechnic university. And I'm just wondering if you could say a word about your experience working with engineers and what it's like to, you know, I feel like it's hard enough to form bridges between social scientists and engineers, let alone people who are trying to push a bit of a radical perspective onto engineers.
Yeah, wow, engineers, they're a tough audience. No, let me say in celebration of where I am now at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, that we have this amazing program here, which one of the reasons I came here to become dean of the global school is because they embed in the engineering education interdisciplinary project-based learning in global locations as well as local locations, but that all this science, technology, engineering students have to do this requirement called an integrative qualifying project in their junior year. And they have an entire term where first, for one term, they study together how to do their projects and getting assigned to sort of project teams, working with their team. And then they travel for 7 weeks with 2 faculty members to one of the project locations. And so the engineers are forced to confront a real world context, local partners, a project sponsor, working in a team, dealing with language, food, culture, and doing it in an interdisciplinary setting. And for me, that's like the best way, I think, to educate future engineers is to make them do that. It's hard work. And I'm hoping that we can kind of infuse into the global school and the programs that exist here, ideas also about ethical engineering, social engineering, in a sense that word is used in Haiti, which is not like the Anglophone use of social engineering, but engineering for the social good, let's say, and ethical travel. And what does it mean for us to travel? What are we doing when we're there? Who are we helping? Who is it benefiting? Who are the partners we're working with? And how are they determining what gets done? So I think all of those things could be built in to have better engineering and social science outcomes. And I'm actually involved in two big research applications with partners around the country here, as well as in Puerto Rico, to develop a sort of a program of work over like 5 years that would bring students to work with community partners and to work on sustainability and climate adaptation. So yeah, we're trying to get the NSF and the National Oceanic and Aeronautics Administration to support that kind of interdisciplinary project-based work.
Thanks. Appreciate the thoughts. Yeah.
Well, I think unfortunately, most folks will have the benefit of your lecture, but not the tremendously insightful Q&A live aspect of your talk, because we'll be posting the talk to the Global Studies YouTube channel, I believe. But I really do want to thank you so very, very much today for visiting with us. Your talk is as timely for Haiti and the Caribbean as it is for this moment in global geopolitics. So thank you very, very much for being with us today. We appreciate your work. We appreciate you taking time out to be with us. And thank you to those who showed up today, and hope that you will join us for the other talks in the series.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be here and to meet you all, and happy to answer any questions subsequently. If anybody wants to get in touch, feel free to email me.
Well,
Bye.